For 40 years, Cuba has been the only communist nation in the Western Hemisphere. During the Cold War, the United States was continually embarrassed to have a staunch ally of Moscow situated less than 150 miles off the coast of Florida. The situation was aggravated by a disastrous American-backed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow the left-wing regime of Fidel Castro in 1961. The ill-planned and badly managed landings of the Bay of Pigs by a CIA-trained brigade of Cuban exiles were total disasters. This abortive operation merely served to strengthen Castro's power base in Cuba. It also pitched him firmly into the Soviet camp. It was a monumental American blunder which a year later precipitated a crisis that very nearly triggered World War III. Cuba had attained independence from Spain as a result of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Up until the end of the 1950s, most Americans regarded Cuba merely as a holiday paradise. The poverty of many of its people went unnoticed. U.S. dollars were the backbone of the Cuban economy and underwrote the dictatorship of General Batista. Some Cubans resented the American dominance of the island, and during the mid-1950s, a guerrilla movement developed in Cuba's hinterland. Fidel Castro, a young lawyer, was its leader. He resented Batista's seizure of power in 1952 and led an abortive uprising against him. After imprisonment and exile, he returned to Cuba in 1956 to set up his revolutionary movement. Playing on the unpopularity of the Batista government and adopting guerrilla tactics against the army, Castro's movement gained increasing popular support. Eventually, it controlled most of Cuba. President Batista was forced to flee the country on New Year's Day, 1959. A week later, Castro and his guerrillas entered the capital, Havana, in triumph. Castro declared he would honor all existing agreements. These included the U.S. leasing of the Guantanamo military base, which it had garrisoned since 1903. America moved quickly to recognize the new regime. Castro, however, still had to battle against pro-Batista guerrillas. He increasingly suspected that they were being supported by the U.S. Washington, on the other hand, feared that in spite of Castro's denials, the regime had a communist agenda. With the Cold War gaining momentum, a pro-Eastern Bloc government in America's backyard was unacceptable. American fears that the Castro regime was extremely left-wing seemed confirmed when Castro embarked on a wholesale program of nationalization. This included the seizing of $1 billion worth of U.S. assets on the island. In retaliation, Washington refused to grant Cuba economic aid. Castro immediately turned to Moscow and through Soviet Foreign Minister Anastas Mikoyan secured a $100 million loan. He used some of this money to buy weapons from the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc states. Increasing nationalization drove thousands of Cubans into exile in the United States. They soon gained the support of a sympathetic U.S. government. In March 1960, a recommendation by CIA Chief Allen Dulles to arm and train Cuban exiles was accepted by President Eisenhower. the CIA set up secret training camps in Guatemala and Panama as a first step towards the liberation of Cuba. As Castro suspected, the CIA was also giving clandestine support to the guerrillas within Cuba itself. In 1960, Democrat John F. Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon for the presidency. With the Cold War growing in intensity, Kennedy accused the Eisenhower administration of complacency and demanded a more aggressive stance against Moscow. He singled out Cuba and made the restoration of democracy to the island a primary issue.
And by helping to free you, the United States has been given the opportunity to demonstrate once again that all men who fight for freedom are our brothers and shall be until your country and others are free.
In the meantime, the CIA was developing its plan for Cuba. Cuban crewed U.S. aircraft were to land exiles on the island. They would destroy Castro's air force and set up an alternative government. Active U.S. intervention would consolidate the new regime. In November 1960, Kennedy emerged triumphant from the presidential election. He would soon be reminded of his pledge to the Cuban exiles. It was a pledge he would have cause to regret. On January 22, 1961, almost as soon as he was installed in office, General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and CIA Chief Allen Dulles visited Kennedy in the White House. They briefed him on the CIA's Cuba plan. Presidential aide Arthur Schlesinger advised against invasion, especially since he believed that it would be difficult to cover up American involvement in it. Kennedy, however, was conscious of his election demand for aggressive action against increasing communist influence in the world. He did not want to be accused by the Cuban exiles of backing out. CIA declarations that once landings had taken place, the Cuban people would support the invasion and turn against Castro also swayed him. Apart from Schlesinger, no one else in the meeting raised a dissenting voice. Kennedy made no decision except to tell the CIA to continue planning. He appointed his brother Robert to oversee the operation. The CIA now warned Kennedy that Castro was about to receive Soviet combat aircraft. On April 4, 1961, he decided that the invasion should go ahead. The CIA also reiterated their confidence in the Cuban people supporting an invasion. Unfortunately, they had tailored their intelligence to justify their strategy. The final plan called for CIA B-26s crewed by exiles to bomb Cuban airfields and destroy Castro's air force. A 1,500-man invasion force would set sail from the Nicaraguan point of Puerto Cabezas and would land in the Bay of Pigs in the Giron area. Additional B-26 attacks would support the invaders. To distract Castro's forces, the CIA started rumors that the main attack would be in the Oriente province, and a diversionary landing was to be made here. There would also be a parachute drop at Giron. A U.S. Navy task force built around the carrier Essex would be offshore, and the exiles were led to believe that this would support them. On April 14th, the invasion fleet of 6 transports set sail from Puerto Cabezas. The following day, 8 B-26s attacked airfields in Cuba. They destroyed 3 aircraft, inflicted 51 casualties, and damaged buildings. The strike alerted Castro to the imminence of invasion. He ordered a mobilization of the country and immediately rounded up a large number of suspects, including most of the CIA agents in Cuba. Cuba raised the matter at the United Nations. The Cuban ambassador directly accused the United States of being behind the air attack. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Adlai Stevenson rejected this, stating that defecting Cuban pilots were responsible.
The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
In truth, Stevenson had been kept in the dark that the CIA, who put Cuban markings on their own planes, had staged this defection. The planes themselves, contrary to what Stevenson had stated, had taken off from Florida. Those who flew them were Cuban exiles employed by the CIA. In spite of the Cuban protest, on the afternoon of April 16, 1961, President Kennedy gave the final go-ahead for the invasion. But he canceled the diversionary Oriente landing and the 2 airstrikes scheduled for the day of the invasion. The die was now cast. In the early hours of April 17th, the landings began. The Cuban exiles were convinced that once they got ashore, they would take part in a march of triumph to Havana. CIA frogmen were the first to land, swimming in to mark the beaches, but they became involved in a firefight with local Cuban militiamen. Castro was quickly told of the attack. He ordered forces to be deployed to the Bay of Pigs. Meanwhile, the exiles seized the townships of Playa Largo and Giron and began preparing the airstrip at Giron for aircraft landings. Just after dawn, however, some of Castro's aircraft appeared over the beachhead. They attacked the anchored transports and hit 2 of them. The remainder withdrew, promising to return at nightfall. They never did so. This airstrike occurred at the same time that the parachute drop began on Giron. The airstrike caused mass confusion. Castro had taken personal charge of operations to repel the invaders. Cuban troops, some in newly acquired Soviet armored vehicles, were soon racing toward the Bay of Pigs. By nightfall, they had surrounded the beachhead and were exchanging fire with the exiles. There were casualties on both sides, but as more Cuban troops arrived, it became clear to the exiles that things were not going as planned. The Bay of Pigs was about to turn into a fiasco. On the day after the invasion, the exiles found themselves increasingly pinned down as Castro's forces surrounding the beachhead grew to 20,000 men, almost 20 times the strength of the exiles. Bitterly disappointed by the failure of their ships to return to the Bay of Pigs, the exiles now looked to the U.S. task force for support. That afternoon, their hopes were raised when U.S. Air Force F-100 Super Sabres flew over the beachhead, but these took no offensive action. That evening, as Castro's forces began to attack into the beachhead, the CIA pleaded with Kennedy to allow Essex aircraft to carry out attacks. The president would only sanction another B-26 strike the next morning with an escort from the carrier. 6 unmarked jets from the Essex flew over the beaches at dawn on April 19th, but the exiles' B-26s had arrived too early. Most were shot down. no more air support would be forthcoming. As the day wore on, it became clear to the exiles that Castro's forces were too strong and that they were trapped. They began to surrender. In all, 1,189 Cuban exiles were captured. 114 had been killed. Castro was quick to take advantage of the dismal failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He could now, with justification, portray the United States as the enemy, and the vast majority of Cubans accepted this. Indeed, the whole sorry saga merely served to dramatically strengthen his regime. As for Kennedy, after a few days of indecision, he was forced to admit U.S. involvement in the operation. He acknowledged that blunders had been made, but said that the American role had been restrained. He ended with a warning.
And I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation. Should that time ever come, we do not intend to be lectured on intervention by those whose character was stamped for all time on the bloody streets of Budapest.
Castro was certainly not going to let the matter rest. In April 1962, the captured exiles were each sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. Castro then went further. On May 21, 1962, one of the most important days in the communist calendar, he publicly announced that Cuba was now firmly in the Soviet camp. What the Bay of Pigs had aimed to prevent had now come to pass. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was quick to take advantage of this. Convincing Castro that an American invasion of Cuba was imminent, Khrushchev was able to deploy Soviet nuclear missiles to the island on the pretext of helping in its defense. This dramatically raised the stakes being played for in the Cold War. In mid-October 1962, American U-2 spy flights over Cuba revealed the existence of Soviet missile sites. Even though the U-2 photographs were clear evidence of the fact, the Soviets initially denied it, and tension grew between the two superpowers. President Kennedy went on national TV.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
For the next few days, as the U.S. naval blockade escalated, the world held its breath. But Kennedy and Khrushchev, now engaged in one-on-one dialogue, eventually reached a peaceful compromise. Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba, while Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile sites and remove them. The Cuban Missile Crisis was at an end. A global nuclear war had been averted. This, however, did nothing to improve U.S.-Cuban relations. They were to remain bitter for years. Even after the end of the Cold War, mutual suspicion remained, and the relationship between the two countries has only gradually thawed. As for the Bay of Pigs prisoners, in December 1962, the Kennedy administration managed to secure their release, but only after supplying Castro with $53 million worth of food and medicine. The Bay of Pigs operation stands out as one of America's major foreign policy blunders of the Cold War era. The CIA made the fundamental error of shaping its intelligence to justify its strategy toward Cuba. This clouded its thinking, especially in its belief that a small force of exiles could overthrow the Castro regime without active U.S. help. The Kennedy administration failed to control the CIA and was naive in believing that it could distance itself from the Bay of Pigs. The penalty for these blunders was paid for by the Cuban exiles themselves.